Welcome back to another episode of Daily Cyber. This is episode 267. If you guys are watching this live, please, any comments, questions you have, please put them in the group in the chats. We'll be monitoring them throughout the episode. That I can ask Paul, who's going to be our guest today on the Daily Cyber. We're going to be able to see these on LinkedIn, YouTube, and on Twitch as well. So if you guys have any questions through the live episode, let us know. If you're watching the recording after, please message us if you have any questions. There's a lot of information we're going to be covering. I want to introduce Paul, someone I've worked with at Arete, the old company, and learned a lot from him when I was in incident response. Paul is currently right now with SRM. He's head of cybersecurity Americas. Paul has over 20 years of experience spanning both the private and government sectors and in roles across leadership, military intelligence, counterterrorism, cybersecurity leadership, and engagement delivery. Before joining SRM, he was a managing director of incident response for a global consulting firm. In this role, he used his experience to help clients who were experiencing complex ransomware attacks. All of us know about that. After a career in the U.S. Army, where he was a subject matter specialist in various facets of the intelligence special operation field, Paul joined PwC. At PwC, he was an engagement manager and focused on cybersecurity strategic transformation projects. He has sufficient experience advising Fortune 100 clients through proactive security transformation efforts and post-breach remediation activities. He had a strong track record of partnering with senior security leaders to mature their cybersecurity posture and program on their strategic journey. Paul also holds an MBA from Norwich University. He was the first graduating class of the Norwich University Strategic Studies and Defense Analysis Program. He also is co-author of the Security Supervision and Management Theory and Practice of Asset Protection. So as you can tell, Paul has a lot of experience, someone that I look up to, and he mentioned me when I was at Arete. So I'm really excited to jump into this today with Paul. So let's hack at it. Here, how's it going, Paul? Just give me 1 second. We'll just make sure your audio's on. There we go. How are you doing today?
Yeah, great, Brandon. How are you doing? Great to be here.
Not bad. How are things going?
Really good. As you can imagine, there's never a dull moment in cyber. Across the incident response and proactive services space, it's always, what's coming on around the corner, the next adversary, the next threat, the next threat actor group. So as you know, and as you live it as well, it's an ever-changing field.
So in 2025, as you're going through kind of incident response management, the industry right now, what are some things that you're looking at that are a concern that specialists, from jumping in the field to senior leadership should be looking at right now?
So as I mentioned, it is a very evolving field, right? When we look at the threat actor landscape, just a couple of years ago, even, it was very much a little bit more consolidated. So you had a couple of threat actors, really kind of core enterprise groups. You had a couple of hobbyists out there, a couple of up-and-comers. As they say, things happen at scale and at velocity in cyber. So what ended up happening there was a lot of the larger enterprise-centric groups started fragmenting. They had internal politics and drama that, of course, created factions. And that drastically changed the threat actor landscape. So the groups that we worked with and against before, as you recall, Brandon, have now splintered, 1 into 3, 3 into 5, 5 into 8 different groups. So you're getting such a multitude of different variables of bad guys out there doing the same thing. Ultimately, right, they're all trying to extort clients for funds, for data, whatever it might be. But the approach in which they do it and how they do it, and ultimately our response collectively as an industry has to be evolving and changing. So I'd say that's a really big one. Outside of that, of course, AI is hot, right? Everyone looks at AI adoption. How can they get more AI centric in their approach to, better optimized business strategy or cost reductions? And that's a tightrope, right? I'm sure you advise a lot of clients on that as well, Brandon. And as you know, there's a really small difference between getting it right and getting it, very, very horribly wrong. So
Right.
really helping clients with that and, seeing what else is out there from the emerging technology side.
That's awesome. Now, jumping back and we're saying that the threat actor landscape, the threat, why does it matter if I know who they are or their subsidiaries or their business model? Why does that matter to me as a business owner or even a cybersecurity professional?
Yeah, so let's start maybe with the lens of a business owner. So ultimately, as a business owner, when it comes to your resiliency and how you're going to be approaching that catastrophic crisis moment of a day, right? If you're not really thinking through your backup and resiliency strategy, it's going to really impact you because ultimately, some threat actors, as you know, only encrypt data.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them ultimately encrypt and steal data, so they perform data exfiltration. Some of them are only doing data exfiltration because they're trying to have a workaround for sanctions and compliance checks that might be triggered if the client is required to pay, right? So ultimately that resilience strategy and what is going to help you really get around that corner on that bad day is really what matters to you as a business owner. Conversely, the attitudes and the kind of social engineering, yesteryear, it wasn't as common to see so many threat actors performing social engineering and going to business owners, family members, other loved ones, business partners, third parties and counterparties, and basically letting them know that the affected entity has had a cyber attack wasn't as common as it is now because ultimately they want to apply that pressure to further extort these clients, right? Mm-hmm. Now, as a practitioner for where you and I sit, it really matters on the response because ultimately look at what's going on with Scattered Spider, right? They've been running around causing a muck and, a lot of different industries and, taking a really surgical approach to really, deconstructing that social engineering component that we're just mentioning and getting into these environments and really using that to privilege escalate, to gain identities, to really get beyond the four walls of those kind of common security tools, right? Because now we're thinking about the weakest link, which is the human, right? Mm-hmm. Conversely, for those that are responding like you and I, how do you really contain that? How do you eradicate that threat? What persistence mechanisms are they leaving behind? Are they going on site to physical, impacted parties to do something with on-premise devices versus just attacking from afar? So it really changes the landscape, and it's a very, very drastic and dynamic changing field.
For sure. Now, you mentioned compliance checks. So you're going through, you got ransomware. I'm a business owner. I'm going through this. What kind of compliance checks do I need to be concerned about or aware of?
So fortunately, that's one thing that we commonly advise as you recall, Brandon, no business owner should really go at this alone, right? Maybe they do have cybersecurity insurance. Hopefully they do. So they can have that broker or that insurer really help them navigate the path to acquire and obtain a breach coach, someone that's going to help them from a legal perspective, if that's required or ultimately recommended. Of course, a forensics provider that's going to help them navigate the containment, eradication of the threat, and ultimately, hopefully help them on threat actor negotiations bit if they need that, or ultimately threat actor intelligence collection, because it's not just about getting to conversations about pay or don't pay, but ultimately there's a lot that can be dissected from a intelligence gathering exercise to further enrich the forensic investigation of how it happened, when did it happen, how did they get in, what was potentially accessed, or the data that was potentially exfiltrated eventually, right? But some business owners, and I get it, right? It's a very nerve-wracking moment. It's very, sometimes it's embarrassing. Sometimes you're like, how could this be me? So you ultimately feel like you're a victim because they are victims, right? They're victims of crimes. And no one should really ever go at that alone. So my recommendation is really invoking the right professional circle around you to get that crisis moment.
Well, as you know, I mean, we've gone through this, the OFAC checks, and that's why I was going to bring out the compliance, right? Like, can you pay them? Because an OFAC checks, one of the factors it checks is, are they a sanctioned organization, right? Right. And can you pay them, or are you going to have the FBI on your door because you paid some terrorist organization and they've now flagged you, right?
Yeah. And look, I mean, it even goes beyond that because ultimately a lot of the financial institutions in the US market for sure, have flagged accounts and frozen assets, because they're worried about being involved in a AML KYC check gone wrong, right? An anti-money laundering check gone wrong. So it's not uncommon for, you to ring up your bank and be like, hey, I need to wire $2 million from point A to point B. It's going to send flags off internally to the financial institution. They're going to ask you what that's for. You're not going to want to lie about it, right? Because that's a crime in itself potentially. So what you want to do is really work with those seasoned professionals that help you understand the pay, don't pay landscape, the compliance landscape, regulatory, legal requirements, all that, to make sure that you as a business owner are best protected in the totality of that transaction, because it's not just what happens then, it's what happens down the line that can ultimately impact you too.
Yeah, and I think that it's 100% something that if you guys don't know, the people who are watching here, like I know you mentioned breach coach. So breach coach in a simple definition, depending on the size of your business, if you ever dealt with one, is really a cyber lawyer.
That's right.
Someone who specializes in cybersecurity and an incident response and has that expertise of compliance, regulatory, understands different industries, and now is brought into the engagement to say, okay, you're in this industry, you're dealing with this situation. I'm going to guide you through the legalities of this situation. And it can be even, reporting it to the FBI. Like
Right.
it can work as you as the facilitator of that. So there's different factors of that, where you have, like you said, you have your carrier that gets engaged because of your policy, and they link you to the right, vendors, be it incident response, forensics, as we call them, breach coaches, but they're cyber lawyers, so people understand. So I'm not looking out for a breach coach online, trying not to find, because I know, talking to lawyers, cyber lawyers, the breach coach term is something they're trying to get away from, but it's something that we know in the industry. You worked in like incident response, that's the term we use for them, right? The label. But I know their expertise in working with, and you and I have hundreds of cases there, that's their expertise, and always work with them, because there's different changes. Like, as you know, there's changes in the industry, changing in what we're doing, changing the process. And I'm sure as AI comes into this evolution, there's going to be things in the legal aspect that they're going to advise in as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head too there, Brandon. There's a lot of expertise that goes into the firms that handle hundreds, if not thousands, of incident response and data privacy matters a year, because as you mentioned, it's not just purely the incident response component, it's ultimately the data privacy component, because there's client, and customer data that's potentially impacted, and you as a business owner needs to understand what your requirements and obligations are to answer the mail against any access or unwanted, exfiltration of that, right? So there's that. We do see some clients that, they have a great relationship with another outside counsel that might not specialize in data privacy, but, they dabble in it there now and again. Dangerous tightrope to cross, because ultimately this is a really big deal, right? When this happens, you kind of got to get it right from the beginning, or it can actually be more timely and costly for a business owner than having worked with that seasoned professional team that, you and I work with countless times. And there's many of them in the industry and in the ecosystem, to really make sure that they get it right.
Yeah. And I think that the other thing is they also know the life cycle of the incident response. Correct. And where the team is in that life cycle. Yeah. Right. Because it's something that you and I have dealt with, is like, are they scoping? Are they in containment? Right. Are they looking at remediation or collection of data and all that? Like, where are they in the life cycle? And a seasoned veteran breach coach lawyer will go, okay, we're here. Where are we in this phase? Correct. Where are we in the next phase? Versus one that might not be seasoned, might not know that.
Correct.
Like, why haven't we got the forensics report yet? We're still containing the environment. Like, we haven't saturated the environment with an endpoint protection, or we don't know if the threat actor's still in the environment. Like, different situations like that.
Totally. And look, I mean, I think you hit a fair point, which is the term breach coach, maybe, sometimes being viewed as like a sunsetting term, which I can appreciate, right? But at its core root, I think, they do tend to embody that skill set of being a coach, right? To your point, really coaching and mentoring the client and holding them through that journey, because it's nerve-wracking, right? You've seen it, I've seen it. We both have experienced clients that have had like significant emotional events around being ransomed or having a critical cyber event happening. I've even worked with a couple that have literally had, C-suite members that have had heart attacks because of the stress that they've been put under, because they've had to make public reporting and other, life-changing potential impacts from the event. So whether they like it or not, in a great way, I still think that there are really great coaches out there in that respect.
100%, right? You and I have worked with different organizations, and you're talking about kind of health concerns and people do it, but it's a 72-hour to maybe a 2-week sprint.
Yeah.
Right. Not having the right team that knows what they're doing when everyone's tired and fatigued. Right. You want to have that person that's a seasoned expert who can say, I got you. We're going to do this. I got you. We're in this phase. We're in this phase. And then also, like, is collaborating with all the teams, not just thinking legal.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The teams that really have that nailed down, that collaborate, intra-team, not only between them, client, external legal counsel or breach coach, and ultimately across any other vendors that are providing that, critical service to the client. We've done countless incidents, as you have too, that you're working with other outside providers of services, and the wrong teams can get together and it turns into like a bit of a knife fight, and that's not good for anybody, right? It's distraction, is discouraging to the client. It makes them feel like things are actually going worse than they are going better. And having teams that can really gel together in that time of crisis to help that client get up and running, which is the first and most critical task, restoring business critical operations so they can begin and restore revenue generation operations is huge, right? So that's how I think everybody wins in that scenario is, getting together blindly on a call, or whether it be remote or in person, and just landing that success up front is really what makes a difference.
100%. Now, if anyone hasn't dealt with it, walk me through like an engagement. I'm a company. I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning. I have this screen now. It says, hey, you've been compromised. Go into this link wherever. I don't know. It's not www, right? What does that look like from start to when you're at like the last phase of, say, a forensics report? What kind of walk me through that?
Sure. So depending on the complexity, of course, of the environment and how many systems are impacted, and ultimately how many systems and sites and international potential locations are involved in the scope of the engagement, they generally last between 3 to 4 weeks, all the way up to 3 to 4 months, really from start to finish. That's not to say that a business is fully down for that 3 to 4 month period, but ultimately as you mentioned, from the time of identification of the incident, from that flash to the ultimate bang of the incident going off, and then ultimately when things are shored up and set, it's a long process, right? As you mentioned, 3, 4 a.m. on a Sunday or Friday, whenever it might be, client walks in to see the blue screen of death, they see ransom notes being printed on their printer, whatever indications they have that something's not going on right, those teams are internally forming. Generally what we see happening there is there's a kind of 1 to 3 hour, maybe 6 hour lag between the moment something's spotted to ultimately them making that first call to their insurer, which is a lot of time. It's a lot of lost time when you think about, again, the calculation of how many dollars have been lost in that period. And then not only that period, but ultimately the period from that point forward can really multiply quickly. Right. So they'll make that first call to their insured, generally, if they're insured, to invoke a claim or to start the claims process, because they might not have gone through hundreds of these, knock on wood, and they'll be a little bit deer in the headlights to say, I have this policy, this is what I'm experiencing, what do I do now? The carriers and brokers that support these clients will then assemble that team or make recommendations potentially, or advise them that their policy stipulates that they can, either bring in retained relationships that they might have, or they might have to use what's called panel providers, which are effectively a group of recommended and vetted professional services firms, whether they be in legal, forensics, or communications, or other avenues of the response team, and really get them on that call.
Now, one thing I want to add there too is remediation, right? I want to add that to that, because you and I know sometimes the clients are too small and have 1 or 2 IT people, and they need hands-on keyboard help. So that's also an aspect that your carrier will talk about as you call in, is like, hey, do you need help for remediation and containment and remediation as well?
Totally. And what we see go really well there is, again, clients that understand that, just because you have an IT provider doesn't mean that you have a core restorative team that can really nail this crisis for you. It doesn't mean that their 9 to 5 business as usual operations aren't right size for that company, but it's like showing up to a house fire with a bucket of water. You need a lot more horsepower than that usually, right? So exactly that, bringing in that restoration firm that understands how to nail the restoration, rebuild, segregation, segmentation, whatever it might be from a technological perspective, to really resume business critical operations, as well as that forensics team that's going to be containing and eradicating that threat. So think about it as a house fire analogy, right? Fire truck shows up, they get the hoses flying. They're trying to contain that fire from spreading further, from getting worse. And ultimately there's some maybe superficial damages, maybe there's some structural damages, but they're really trying to put out that fire.
With that analogy too, something I want everyone to think about too is that the fire moving laterally to your next door neighbors is the analogy for us, that moving out in the environment from system to system, location to location, or downstream liability to your
Yeah.
clients or partners from there too, right?
Right. No, that's exactly it, Brandon. I mean, how many times have you and I responded to incidents whereby either the client impacted was from a third party, right? So it's this entity that had a ransomware attack that then permeated its way onto that other client or downstream, like you mentioned, and or vice versa, where they have an incident and they're worried about the containment of that to exceed their four walls and go to their critical third parties, vendors, and suppliers, which is a big deal, right? Because there's a lot of contractual liability and limitations around that too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So from that point, as I mentioned, the forensics teams would be engaged, the legal teams would be engaged. Statement of works are being generated against what we're seeing and what the collected parties are seeing for the required services to be rendered for that client. That client then brings that statement of work or that contract back up to their carrier for approval. At that point, generally speaking, the carriers would approve that body of work or maybe make some modifications or request modifications to be made on the totality of the scope based on their understanding of the environment and the client's requirements. Then it's off to the races, right? Our teams and other teams out there are deploying security tooling, containment tooling.
Mm-hmm.
Many times those are endpoint detection response leading tools out there.
So why is that important?
So yeah, back to the firefighter analogy, is really about taking an additional security containment blanket around the totality of the environment to reduce the ability for the threat actors to either go further in the environment, move laterally, and ultimately the goal is to kill the persistence, which means them retaining connectivity to that environment, right? And stop anything that's malicious or suspicious, and ultimately kill and quarantine those threats.
Why would I do? And I'm going to ask you a question because you and I have heard this.
Yeah,
but I have Bitdefender. I have Bitdefender. It's in my environment. I paid for it. Why do I need CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, something else, right?
Yeah. Well, there's two reasons. At face value, I always say, look, never, at this point, they've gotten past a goalie with whatever technology you have. So changing that goalie might be in your best interest to make sure that we can, again, change that technique, tactic, or procedure, the TTP, and really get on the offensive against the bad guy by killing out this fire, removing the persistence, and ultimately killing and quarantining any additional risks that might be exposed at that moment. Part of that strategy, as you know, too, Brandon, is to sever, where possible, that outbound connectivity. So that way we can incubate that risk and make sure that it doesn't, again, go further. The bad guys don't have additional hooks in the environment. And really, that's what kicks off the forensics work, right? The containment and eradication of that threat. And then it starts getting more investigative, right? We start collecting evidence and artifacts and logs from systems, from firewalls, from, whatever is available to understand what happened, how it happened, and ultimately, what risk does that client have from a data exfiltration and access perspective? Because now we're arming the legal discussion further with those findings to better inform the client of what might be around the horizon. Because ultimately, there's two angles to the forensics providers, kind of critical task. One, stopping that fire and guarding and safeguarding all those assets again, right? As well as, if they have an integrated restoration team, making sure that that client can restore business critical operations as quick as possible, or partnering with one, right? And then the second key component is really edifying the investigation of how it happened and helping paint that story. So that way, if there's anything else, any windows, doors, hatches that need to be closed down and secured, that can take place, as well as, better providing insights to the regulatory compliance bit that might be following that incident.
Now, one thing I want to add to, some people don't realize that. That's why I bring up the endpoint protection. The tools sometimes that we're using day to day are tuned for our environment, where if you have an expert that comes in that uses CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, they've tuned it specifically for an engagement, looking at, because again, they're dealing in a day in and day out. They see where the threat is going, where potential exclusions might have happened, or what things that might be flagged that could be causing the incident. So they're doing that investigation and have a more deeper bench of the tools to put into the environment, which is specifically tailored to incident response.
That's correct. Yeah, that is correct. I mean, back to your original point of a client says, I have tool A, B, or C. Why do I need to, for the purposes of the engagement, change it? Like, they don't really understand. And it really goes back to some tools, just like any other tool in your toolkit, are better suited for certain tasks versus others, right? We do find that, if we take a step back and look at things agnostically, Trend Micro, SentinelOne, and CrowdStrike are probably the industry-leading firefighting tools out there that when there's a crisis moment, you need to really put out that fire. That's, I'd say that the top tier tools that are out there to really knock that out of the park.
Now, I have a question from the community, and they're talking, and this totally makes sense, right? Yeah. This sounds all good for a large organization, but how can a small to mid-sized organization get a leg up on this?
Yeah. So a couple of key things, right? Back to, when you mentioned my intro, having advised clients, when I was at the Big Four, when I was at PwC, and we're speaking about, large global financial institutions, consumer packaged goods companies. I mean, really cream of the crop Fortune 50s, right? They're facing the exact same threats and risks that you and I creating a startup tomorrow would face, because at the end of the day, is scale, technology, and data, right? If you can just think of it in very, very basic terms, you as a business owner are trying to protect data, whether it be your internal IP, whether it be client and sensitive data, whether it be healthcare data for your employees. At the end of the day, that data still needs to be protected. Now, there's a difference between you and I having 5 employees versus company A that has 50,000 employees, because that just means you're casting a wider net and there's more at risk. But ultimately, a data security event is still a data security event, right? Small to mid-sized business owners, I think, don't get the right attention that they deserve, because ultimately, if you think of any global economy, they're ultimately the heartbeat of that. When we take a step back, I mean, sure, the Fortune 50s do what they do, and they do an amazing job at large scale revenue generation. But when we think about employment, local, resources, local communities, they don't get the right education and outreach that I think that they could definitely be afforded. There's a lot of programs, even those that, are within the 4 walls of my company now, that are designed, and others do the same thing. They're designed for those small to medium businesses that don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend on security, but can still get the right proportional security tooling, procedures, policies, and just insights. I mean, look at what you do. You're on the virtual CISO CIO track as well. And there's a lot of entities that I'm sure you advise or that could reach out to you that would benefit from just, a 2-hour call a month,
Right.
5 hours a quarter. And that doesn't need to be bank breaking, but the difference between that experience and education, that perspective, versus trying to, again, go at it alone can go such a long way.
And I want to kind of go back to the original question. The process that you're talking about, instant response, is the process for all size companies. And
right.
Paul, you and I have dealt with this, working in that previous company. We would deal with and almost talk about dog, and I'd make a joke of it. It's like dog grooming businesses to Fortune 100.
Yeah.
You'd still go through that same process, right?
100%.
You go time and time again. Now, the smaller company, because their infrastructure is small, it might be quicker, but still the same process, right? And depending if they have backups that they can restore and they don't have to pay ransomware, there's certain aspects might drop off. Or if they're like, yeah, we'll just accept the loss of that data, that's fine because we're a small company. It does happen, right? But the thing that we have to think about too is the impact on a smaller company can be financially more detrimental to the company because they don't have the big budgets.
That's
so
right.
Them losing the $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 of business is detrimental to the business. Where I've worked with some companies, and it's where they were questioning if they had to close their business.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're spot on, Brandon. Especially when you think about cash-based businesses, right? When you think of those that don't have large capital reserves to float them for, look at payroll, for example, right? I know you and I have done a couple together that is so typical, right? It's like a Friday at 5 going into a long weekend. Next week's payroll, I can't access my payroll data and HR data. So how am I going to get that done? Or the money that they're asking for a ransom demand and I don't have viable backups, or forcing me to get into a close the business down / pay my employees or not discussion, right? Because ultimately, even if they have insurance coverage, that's not an overnight thing, right? It's not like if the insurer broker can just show up tomorrow and stroke you a check for a large sum of cash to, float you immediately. There's a lot that goes into this. And to your point, I mean, when you think of a large scale enterprise being impacted, that fits and feels completely different versus, a small operation that is just really doing a great job in the community or in the region, but ultimately can't afford 15, 20 days of an outage because it's going to cause some serious financial hardships.
100%. And depends on what you're talking about too. It depends on the cybersecurity policy they're paying for and
Right.
that coverage too, because if you're not paying for outages and downtime and support on financial losses, it might not be part of your policy. So you are now held out there. You have to pay the ransom. You have the overhead of the cost of the actual event. You're doing, like you talked, now you have to pay payroll, and insurance is only going to cover you for so much, right? Maybe a breach coach, some forensics, some remediation. And that's all you can pay for insurance because you didn't want to pay a big insurance policy.
Yeah.
Understandable, but again, things that I think are important, and I think this is what one of the questions going to is, and I'm going to ask you is, so if I'm a small company, what do I need to do?
Yeah. So a couple of key things there. And before I go into that question, because that's a really good one, I want to also highlight another part that ties into it as well, which is some companies just don't have cyber insurance. So then what, right? There are a lot of shops out there, unfortunately, that will shy away from those that are uninsured, right? Because it's a risk. Because ultimately, if they don't have that coverage in that policy, there's not a little bit of a safety net from a receivables recoupment, right? Because ultimately, if you're providing services that are $20, $30, $50, $100,000 worth of services on a hope that the end client that's uninsured will pay you, a lot of companies have shied away from that. So that in itself, as a business owner, is a risk that I keep front of mind as well, right? What should they do? Well, number one, at a minimum, establishing some key relationships out there with trusted vendors and providers of services. That way, when you have an issue, when you have a crisis, you're not scrambling on Google trying to figure out who you're going to call. Like, that's free. That does not cost anything. Right. Making the introductions, having those relationships and those doors open, I mean, it goes so far, because I know that I've been called countless times on random days by people that we've spoken to in the past that we don't have a contractual relationship with at all, that have been like, hey, I'm in a pinch and I just need 15 minutes of your time to see if I'm thinking through this correctly. It didn't cost anything, but they invested in that relationship building up front, right? So they were like, let me be proactive and find out if we need to do something on the forensics and containment side and work with a trusted third-party provider. Who would I call, right? Like, I mean, just answering that, having your internal kind of playbook built out, which of course ties to planning. So of course, tying to incident response planning. So having a playbook doesn't need to be 55,000 pages long. It can literally be 3 to 4 pages long to say, if we have a cyber event, this is what we're going to do, right? Planning, thinking through what are your critical systems and applications. If you only could bring up a couple of them, which ones are you bringing up and why? Murphy's alive and well. I say this all the time. Small businesses are at a greater risk of it happening on a holiday, of course, just like every other business. And the key stakeholders that would be driving the decision making maybe aren't there. Maybe they're on a cruise. Maybe they're on a vacation with their family. Maybe they're out camping. They don't have access to a cell phone signal. What's that continuity and succession planning looking like? So that way, whoever's left behind can take this livable, breathing, working document and at least try their best to navigate it in the absence of direction, right? Mm-hmm. Again, low cost, low budget, high ROI, right? Mm-hmm. When you think through technology, again, there's still some really great programs out there for small companies to leverage really unique and bleeding edge endpoint detection response tooling for $10 to $15 per system per month. I mean, it's not thousands of dollars. And I think there's a stigma that unless you're investing a bucket of money every single month, you can't be secure. And it's just not true.
Right. And I think to go back through this, and I know people are listening to this, I'm going to draw kind of a process for you that I've seen that's worked, is that you have to do a risk assessment. Do a risk assessment on your business, like you were talking about, is what's the critical systems, what's the critical data, what's the critical processes. So at least you know what you have to restore.
That's right.
And that goes down to your business continuity plan. Like, what do I need to come up to survive? Doesn't matter if you're a massive organization or a small, 5 people, 10 people operation. What does that look like? Because then your disaster recovery plan is how do you recover those systems? And in the time frame and recovery time objective, recovery point objective of that plan of when you're restored. And then having your instant response, like you're talking about, Paul, is like, okay, what does it look like? When do I break the glass? My security instant response team, when do I engage them? How do they get engaged? When do I get the DR plan going, right? Disaster recovery plan. When do I do all that? as a small organization, if you have those processes in place, at least you have a breathing room because you have a manual, right? You have a manual of what to do in the case of an incident, right? And then anyone can have it. Anyone understands in the environment, like you're saying, succession plan, people away. You're transitioning staff. We see this a lot in the industry right now. People are being let go, and new people are coming in. Well, the new person comes in, an incident happens, and I've heard this come in. I just started 2 weeks ago. I don't know what's going on, right?
Yeah.
But having those documents that they can refer back to, that's easy to consume, easy to follow, step by step, I think that's important. Then I agree with you is then tooling.
Yeah.
Do you have a backup plan?
Correct.
Or your backup strategy? Can you restore from data? Is it, we had Andy Moss on last week. He was talking about, data restoration, but do you have a tested backup strategy that can be restored in the case of an incident?
Yeah.
Right. Do you have the hardware, the software? Do you have detection response? Can you detect something? I know, I guess it was a couple months ago, I was working with a company and they called me and said, oh my God, it was so good because we had an incident, but we're able to contain it so quickly. It didn't actually impact us.
Yeah.
We saw it, we found it, we contained that, the endpoint that was starting to show suspicious malicious activity. We contained it and there was nothing else from that. We cleaned the system. We stopped that IP address. We were good.
Yeah.
And that's what you and I want to see, right, from this.
100%. I mean, again, if you know the basics, it's like I tell people all the time, pulling a little bit of an adage from my time in the military: sweat now so you don't bleed later, right? Put in the hard work now, put in the hard yards now to be prepared, resilient, and the response. That way, when it does happen, because it will happen at some point in time, it's not a life-changing event.
Mm-hmm. I think those are key factors. Now, was anything else you would add to that?
Well, I mean, you hit it too, the backups. I mean, countless times, it's interesting. A lot of clients will put a lot of investment proportionality into detection tooling versus resilience. And I think that dollar for dollar, having safe, secured offline copies that should something happen, whether it be a cyber event, whether it be an unintentional outage, whatever it might be, you can restore critical services and data and applications to as fast as possible to meet your business requirements. That's where we're trying to promote a lot more investment into our client base, because we've seen time and time again that that's what really matters, besides that really, galvanized goalie tooling, which is that EDR, the endpoint detection response tooling. Those are bang for buck, outside of course, identity management, so multi-factor authentication and all that. That's where your biggest investment ROI comes from.
Well, I think you added that in multi-factor authentication. I think one thing I've seen is understanding how to use it. Like, you don't just kind of spray it and everyone has multi-factor authentication. Exactly. What's the business reason you're using it? What the security reason? I think something I've educated clients is the privilege accounts, the access to data, right? The least privileges, all that you're thinking about in your mind is who has access to these critical, and going back to the business risk assessment, the business continuity plan, who has access to these critical systems, and how do I reduce that privilege and access and then create layers? So if it's two-factor authentication, separate accounts, whatever that may be, so that if a threat actor gets in, it's harder. Now, you and I know it's not when, but it's if.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. If they get in, if they're able to do that, if they're able to do this, then it does happen. Right. Yeah. So with that thinking and process, you want to create those layers so you can alert and hopefully disable that account.
Correct. Exactly. And, identity management is so critical nowadays, and you don't need to make a significant investment into some, brand new bleeding edge privileged identity management or privileged access management solution. Again, be pragmatic, right? Think through who needs access, why do they need access, and then segregate access accordingly. There's really low cost ways out there of doing role-based access controls, especially if you're using Azure AD or anything like in the cloud. There's ways that you can really segment that effectively without bleeding the bank. And I think it's just about education, right? It's, again, working with trusted providers that can talk to you and say, if I were in your shoes, given your security constraints for funding, this is how I'd approach it in a tiered fashion. So that way they can not feel like they're being overwhelmed by the whack-a-mole or paper cut to death of security procurement, which is a lot.
Right. 100%. Now, with instant response, anything else you'd want to add that people should know?
There's a lot. The key thing I had mentioned is, outside of the trusted relationship, fostering up front and the instant response plan that we discussed, just know that what you might go through, others have gone through it, and it's not, generally speaking, it's not as bad as it feels in that moment. You will get around the corner, right? Having personal resilience as a professional, as a business owner, or as a small security team member is key. We've worked with, in countless entities that the mentality and what I'll say the intestinal fortitude around getting through that crisis is what really determines how, kind of emotionally beat down these teams can feel, because you're working long hours. You're like, oh my gosh, this is the worst day. Like, of course, it's maybe a loved one's birthday or an outing or a vacation on the horizon. And it feels like there's this wall of work that just won't end. It does get better, right? Understanding that before you're stuck in a cyber event is critical, because it's such a morale killer, right? You and I have definitely worked with some clients that have displayed a lot more kind of emotional resiliency than others. And I think that, just taking a step back and knowing that that's a real thing is critical, especially if you're a business owner, or especially if you're on a, security team that's maybe working for a small organization. It's just having that kind of leadership mindset to be like, look, this really sucks, but we will get through it. And afterwards we'll figure out what happened, why it happened, and what we could have done differently. And then let's focus on that. Let's focus on getting better beyond this.
Now, one thing I want to add to that is I think most organizations need to do this more, is tabletop exercises and scenario based, because it does create that. Did we fill the gaps? Was there a challenge with that? Because I remember working with one client and they were like, oh, our restoration, they had an outside company that did their backups, and they were able to do that. And they're like, oh, we'll get our backups within 24 hours. Yeah. They went through a scenario and had the vendor there, and the vendor corrected them. No, it's 72, because we have to now export the data. We have to test the backup. We have to ship the backup over to you. And if it's on the weekend, right? If it's on Friday, you're not going to get it until Tuesday. And they're like, whoa. We were told it was 24-hour turnaround time. So going through that in a scenario in not a live environment helps you to tune to see where your gaps are.
Look, I'll tell you something about backups that people always forget, is that backups are on a light switch, right? Backups are ultimately constrained by the velocity in which your internet service provider can pipe that data back in, right? People don't think about those layers that are required to successfully, at a high pace, restore your backups. It's not just, oh, we're going to invoke the backups and then boom, you clap your heels and then you're there, right? I wish, if I could, I'd invent that tomorrow, right? But ultimately that doesn't exist like that today. And until you really have to test that, look, the reality is a lot of providers out there will make a lot of lofty claims on the velocity in which you can restore from your backups. Try it. Actually try it. Don't just take their word for it. Really understand how long it's going to take, which data source you need to restore from first. Again, back to your business continuity and resilience piece, right? Having a plan around that. Around the tabletops, great call out, but I'd actually take it a step further and say, I always recommend 3 tabletops. And the reason why is because you should have a technical team one, an executive team one, and a combined. Right. Because generally, as you know, the technical teams don't want to look bad in front of the exec teams. Yeah. The exec teams don't want to look bad in front of the technical teams for lack of decision-making potentially. Right. Or not knowing the right answer to pipe up at that time. So get them in their own friendly environments or safe spaces. Let them nail the process. Let them nail the understanding of what they should be doing and how. Mm-hmm. Then bring them together in that third one to really make sure that everyone knows how cohesive they should be working for it to shine. So that way there's a confidence and trust building on the offset of that. So that way when it happens, everyone knows their place. Everyone has a little bit more confidence in their own individual performance and ultimately those of those around them.
So now, again, because we're dealing with different size organizations, it might be not being the budget to be able to do 3 tabletop exercises for the year. I'd recommend this if you're a small organization. Focus on the technical tabletop exercises versus the executive one, because you can do a debriefing with the executives after and train them and talk about decision-making process. But the technical one's going to be the one that gets you out of that fire.
100%. If you can only invest in one, I say for sure the default one to invest in is a technical one, because again, great decision makers out there might not be able to recreate domain controllers and domain admins and everything else that required for you to get back up and running. So if you can only invest in one, make sure it's a really, really strong technical one that really pressure tests the resiliency, the backups, the response, the playbooks. And don't just let the smartest people in the room be the one speaking. Really get your mid-level, resources out there to be in the spotlight, because again, Murphy's alive and well. And if you hog all the airtime as the CISO or deputy CISO, what if you're on vacation? I always go to tabletops and I can see that there's a couple of leaders out there that always want to run it. And I say, yep, you know what? You and I are at Starbucks right now, so you don't get to know what's going on. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, but this person is, 3 levels down. Can they pick up the playbook? Can they pick up the IRP? Can they pick up where you would want them to in that crisis? Because again, succession planning is where the rubber meets the road.
100%. And one of the things that you talked about this, we do when I was doing tabletop exercises and I do with clients is, as you're doing the scoping, you're talking and you're looking at who's the strongest person in the team, who's actually answering all the questions, all that. Normally in the scenario, we pull them out. We let them know, like the point of contact, hey, we're going to pull them out. They're out, completely out. They're offline. Their phone's not accessible. They can't access email, all of that. And then we're gonna test the rest of the team. Yeah. And they're like, well, but hold on. They're like the key subject matter expert. And like your point, exactly. It can't be. It needs to be across, not shared knowledge across the whole team, because you never know when it's going to happen. It's not scheduled and planned. The threat actor doesn't go, John's on shift today, I'm going to start my ransomware attack now. Right? It's not that way. It
never is.
Like you said, a holiday, Christmas holidays, everyone's off, someone's on vacation, and all of a sudden, boom, right? There's an incident.
Exactly. So that's, an easy, low-cost way of bringing more reality to any scenario, right? It's just, muting the voice of the strongest decision maker or technical knowledge, kind of resource in a room, and you can see how things can unravel so quickly. And I think it's a great call out for, those in the C-suite or exec team that realize that there's an over-reliance potentially on 1 or 2 people when it comes to that crisis response.
Right. And then there needs to be cross training. There needs to be, knowledge transfer so that you bring the whole team up, right?
That's right.
Now, got another question for you, Paul. With being a head of cybersecurity, what do you look for in talent in your IR team?
Great question. So, a few key things that I always say, regardless if it's for our IR team or our proactive services team, is, attitude and culture over technical aptitude, because you can always train that one quicker than the latter, right? Mm-hmm. Incident response is a demanding field. You know it, I know it, it's not a 9 to 5 thing. It's not a, no weekends thing. It's not a non after hours thing. And really understanding that, getting into IR is a big thing, because ultimately you can't kind of sort of help people on their worst day, right? It's like kind of sort of working the ER, right? Kind of sort of being a firefighter. That mentality for incident response has to be such a forefront attribute that when I interview people, especially on either their first or their last interviews with us, like first or finals, I really dig into that, because it's hard to really, step away from sometimes. And it's a reality of the work. I mean, regardless if you're a brand new analyst all the way to, those in my kind of role, you're always having to pay attention to what's happening. And sometimes, that can be daunting, right? Because you feel like you kind of can't step away from it. So in the same vein, making sure that that person understands how to properly separate themselves from it when they can and when they need to, right? Because ultimately it can consume you. So having that resiliency, having the really means to make sure that you understand how to give it your all, but ultimately give yourself your all too, and those around you. Because if you don't, the core work of IR can consume you as a professional. Right. So I'd say those are really key attributes. The next thing I'd say is having a passion for learning. Incident response, like I mentioned in the beginning with the threat actor groups, it moves so fast, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just how to rebuild this or how to contain that or how to deploy this tool or not. It's really understanding what's happening from, an ecosystem of threat and risk actors, or, the threat actors out there. If you don't have that kind of tenacity and passion to keep learning and keep reading and be on the websites and go on the, different portals to like understand what's happening with this group or that group, or really staying current, it won't really be for you, right? So you have to have that kind of professional and, kind of academic hunger, I'd say, to really get after it.
Right. I think some things I'd add to, just from my experience too, is understanding how to negotiate and communicate. I mean, you're with different stakeholders.
Yeah.
You're talking to council, you're talking to the carrier, you're talking to C-suite, you're talking to the MSP or MSSP, you're talking to your forensics team, the SIM team. You have all these people you have to negotiate with time and what's going on and collaborate, which includes project management, right? Understanding timelines and deliverables and being able not to be the dog in the room. And I'd say like the dog with a bone and being mean and cruel, and they never want to work with you, but how do you collaborate them and negotiate the timing, how things are going, deliverables, and then be able to communicate upwards to council, carrier, the senior leadership, right? And then advise them. Like, a lot of times you and I had to deal with is, I don't know what to do. Paul, tell me what I need to know. Tell me what I need to do. And you have to pull from forensics. You have to pull from SIM. You have to pull from these teams. You have to pull from that to give them the right information and understand how to deliver. Because as well, and you mentioned that, the stress of that, I'm not going to, get them to drink by a fire hose and tell them everything all at once. I'm going to give them in chunks. Right? How did you, do you have any questions about that? And then next, and then next. And then it might be like you and I've done, let's cover that next meeting.
Exactly.
And you and I know is tomorrow. It's tomorrow morning at a stand-up call, but they need to know how many endpoints are now saturated with the endpoint. How are we doing that? Has negotiation started? Has that? How are we doing with forensics? Okay, that's all I can take on because we're doing restoration. We can't take on anymore. Great, I'll see you guys tomorrow, right? And they're done, right?
But I mean, I'd actually call that out, your way too, Brandon. I mean, I think that was always one of your strengths is understanding how to, really manage those relationships, because if you come in there and you're only speaking technical jargon to a CFO and they're the key decision maker because the other C-suite members and CISO maybe are out or whatever, and you're only just spitting forensic artifacts data and you're speaking in UTC time zones and you're just, it sounds like Charlie Brown after 5 seconds. You just hear womp, 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 right? And really drilling that down to say, okay, who am I speaking to? Who's the audience? What do they need to know? What, if I were in their shoes, what would I want to know? And really conveying it in the least technical perspective to make sure that you're getting the right points across. You're edifying the conversation. You're adding value, not just soaking up time. That's how you make a big difference.
Especially in the IR. And I think that's something we've always done is, especially in IR, when they're overwhelmed, they want support and guidance, and you're the trusted person in the room.
Yeah.
Because you and I know they go and turn to us and go, so Paul, what do you think?
Exactly.
I've heard from this guy. I heard that, Paul, tell me what I need to do. And you're that trusted person to say, okay, we're here. We've got this. Let me guide you through this.
That's right. And it's a one-shot thing, right? You don't get to do too many do-overs in that space because, again, they're expecting you to provide the high-level expertise and guidance at that moment, at that time, in that crisis.
100%. Now, last question. I know something I wanted to talk about and cover is, how are things with the AI space? What's some of your concerns, things you're looking at?
Yeah. Everyone's trying to get into AI, and I applaud them for it. I think there's a lot on a business level, whether you're at a Fortune 50 or whether you're a brand new startup, that you can accomplish with AI. The biggest problem that we're seeing across the deployment or desire to get deeper into AI is really around data governance, right? Okay. I always joke that data governance has been like the orphan child that has been left behind when it comes to investment, because it's not exciting to say, well, we're going to classify all of our data. We're going to put new retention policies around all of our data. We're going to make sure that all the data is properly understood by its location and density and how it can be used for or against us. Because generally, a lot of organizations have said, well, that's a legal thing. And another organization are like, well, that's a compliance thing or an audit thing, or some organization like, well, that's kind of a security thing. So everyone wants to get into AI, but foundationally, that crawl walk exercise of really having strong data governance protocols hasn't been in place. And now they're trying to show up to the Olympics and run a 440, right?
Right.
When you do that, you have way more that can go wrong than you can have that goes right, whether it be on a process optimization, cost efficiency, or staffing efficacy side. So really just taking a breath, getting strong governance around your data and what would be at risk or impacted in the use of AI is such a critical thing. And it sounds bleak to say, but when we bring that to organizations, it's almost like you kind of stole their kind of shiny toy away from them, because they realize that, you're right. And they do need to start there before they can really accelerate the path of AI. Now, the flip side of that coin is bad guys have no rules for the use of AI because they can engineer and work with AI way quicker than the good guys can for their use. And that's why we're seeing so much in the smishing, vishing, and phishing side blowing up, because they can just run a couple of, chat GPT scripts or, fraud GPT kind of scripts ultimately, right? And get out there at scale without risking data governance and exposure, because it's a one-way attack versus you're defending your crown jewels and then adding an AI layer around that to optimize. They're just saying, let me take this single source tool and use it for what I want. So they will have inherently the edge on the use of AI, which is scary, right? I mean, we've seen a lot of email compromise on the rise. We're seeing a lot more of it brought into the wrapper of, malware, refinement, and ultimately tooling. So it's hard, but I mean, AI is hot, right? I mean, we can't run away from that. Everybody wants to move more and more into AI, and it's just about really coaching them to do it the right way.
Yeah, I think, like you said, due diligence. And I was thinking as you were talking here, I interviewed a couple, I think it was like 2 years ago, Mike Milo from Life Labs, and he was talking about his security analysts and people that in his environment, he wanted to have this CNP or CNA to understand data flow.
Yep.
Right. It was so important for them to understand and how to secure the environment, which, just like you're talking about, I think the due diligence when it comes to AI, a lot of organizations I talk to think about the innovation, the efficiencies, and oh my God, it's going to save us a lot of time. This is such a great tooling. And then we can record our meeting and update the calendar and send out an email and do all this great stuff. But is there anything confidential? Is there anything that shouldn't be recorded? Oh, what do you mean? Well, we're talking about a new project and it's going to be copyrighted. It's going to be, we're going to have a patent around it. Well, where's that data being stored? Well, it's just in ChatGPT. It's somewhere open source. And it's like, okay, well, have you thought that through? Oh, and then you kind of get the light bulb moment where they're like, no, well, we never thought that was a concern.
Yeah, it's deep. Look, it's deep water. That water is very deep. And not to mention, we've already seen other nation states out there leveraging, open source LLMs and others to put a nice shiny wrap around it, get some commercial kind of exposure to it. People start buying it, putting data into it, not realizing really where it's going. And then they're like, uh-oh, we can't receive this, so what happens now? So it's, again, I think it's going to be amazing where things will go with AI. It's just about being really responsible. There's a lot that can happen with data bias, data poisoning, it's got to be smart with it. I think we'll all get there.
Due diligence and due care is something I talk to a lot of the companies is, right, making sure that you care about the security and what you're doing. And your due diligence have some sort of assessment tool that you've developed that you're going to go through each tool, each vendor, each partner, because we know as well as I do, there's partners out there that are integrating AI into their tooling.
That's right.
But how does that work, and having those proper assessments?
Yeah, that is correct.
Awesome. Now, Paul, best way to get a hold of you would be LinkedIn?
That's right. Yep. Best way is me LinkedIn. Thank you for splashing on the screen there. It's been amazing being on the show today with you, Brandon. I'm looking forward to being on another episode on another topic someday. Awesome.
Now, if you guys have any questions, and here's this company, srminform.com, write that down. You guys have, knock on wood, you don't have an incident, you don't have to deal with it. But if you want to do some proactive service, you want to reach out and just have some questions, reach out to the organization. It's kind of great to have them on the stream and really kind of talk about this, because I think it's important to keep this front of mind, to have this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you so much, Paul. I'm going to drop you off right now.
Great.
So everyone, that was a great stream. I mean, we talked about a lot of great information when it comes to instant response, AI technologies, due diligence, programs, the disaster recovery, business continuity plan, even doing a risk assessment, business continuity plan, disaster recovery, instant response. So all the things that doesn't matter what size of organization, these are key areas of your business that when you're looking at security, you need to work on, right? Doing tabletop exercises with your team to be able to look at, is things working the way we planned it? It might look good on paper, but when you get into a scenario and talk it through and go through someone that can guide you through that incident and share the roadblocks, share the challenge you run into, you start to look at, is this plan actually going to work? Is it something we can pull out in the middle of an incident, break glass, and start working through? So things I want you guys to really think about. And then the last thing is the due diligence in AI, right? Really kind of think about, if you're going to start looking at AI tools, AI integration, implementation, how are you testing it? Test the measurable results. And something I tell all my clients is have somewhere to test it that you can score it. Right? You can say, okay, yeah, does it pass our due diligence? Does it meet our requirements that we're good and we can run with it? Or there's concerns, there's gaps here that we're concerned that if it goes any further past, we might be vulnerable and we might be at risk of, data being, shared that is confidential, lack of security measures on these toolings that now can be compromised, things that you guys know well enough that we have to do our due diligence. So a lot of great information, a lot of great things to think about. One thing I always want to remind you guys at the end of the stream is don't forget, software is hackable, being connected is vulnerable. I'll see you next Daily Cyber.